True or false? The Holy Spirit would never have you do something that is considered immoral. False. Let me give my best 12 examples. 12 signifying God's authority, 6 in the Old Testament and 6 in the New. I'd like to make a side note that Christian apologists have tried and maybe have done a good job defending why God can still be morally good in our eyes for doing all these things. They personally, though, don't satisfy my thirst for truth. So example 1, Genesis 22. Genesis 22 speaks of Abraham being told by God to sacrifice Isaac. Whether it's the command to kill or that God would trick Abraham in such a way, something about what God has done is unethical, right? Example 2. How about when Joseph is being sold into slavery by his brothers and all the injustices caused to him? You might ask, what does God have to do with that? Yet Joseph admits in saying in Genesis 50:20, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You probably didn't catch that. It was God's intention for the story of Joseph to go the way that it did. Example 3. Deuteronomy 20:16 through 18. The Israelites' genocide of the wickedness in Canaan. It says, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. As crazy as it sounds, Leviticus 18:24 through 30 explains that God has pronounced judgment on them before all of this and is desiring the elimination of the opportunity for the Israelites to stray away from God. Example 4, 1 Samuel 15. God commands for Saul and his army to, in verse 3, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all things that belong to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Verse 9 and 10. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Then Saul and Samuel had a little back and forth. Then in verse 22 and 23, but Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Then, to the surprise of even King Agag, Samuel chops off his head and leaves like it was nothing. So, not only does God command murder, but he despises Saul's sacrifice and his attempt at doing good, because he would rather Saul obey him, and then Samuel did the job because it needed to be done. Example 5, Isaiah 22. At the time, the Lord spoke by Isaiah, the son of Amos, saying, Go and loose the sackcloth from your waist and take off your sandals from your feet. And he did so, walking naked and barefoot. I don't really have an explanation for this, and I hope no one would try to argue that being completely naked everywhere you go for 3 years is a moral thing to do. Example 6, Hosea marrying a prostitute and having children with said prostitute. Hosea 1:2 says, When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, Go, take to yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. Again, and no offense to anyone in the industry, but we should be at least a little surprised and confused that God would command a prophet. So example 7, Matthew 8:28 through 34. Jesus transferred a legion of demons to a herd of pigs that ran into the sea and drowned themselves, basically taking the property of others and destroying the economy of a whole city. Example 8, Matthew 18:6 through 7, where Jesus says basically, if anyone makes one of my believers to stumble, it would be better for them to have a big rock hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Side note, what's beautiful about this one? Yeah, I know that's weird. But what's beautiful about this one is that it shows the same heart that God the Father had for cleaning out the land of Canaan for the Israelites. Jesus hates anything that causes his sheep to stumble, but regardless, Jesus is telling a certain kind of people to commit a suey-wooey, and that's just not nice, right? Example 9, John 2:13 through 16. Jesus was violent and angry while he flipped tables and he used a whip in the temple of God. Yes, a whip, right? He went Indiana Jones on everybody and drove everyone out because of the injustices that were happening. But I ask you, does the end ever justify the means, especially for an all-knowing, wise being? Example 10, Acts 5:1 through 11. Ananias and Sapphira sold a piece of land and donated the money to the church as everyone else was doing. Yet they sold it for way more than they claimed they did, and they secretly kept the profit. And they continued in their claim that they donated all they made from the land to the church. They both instantly died when confronted about it. Tell me how lying or mild corruption is deserving of capital punishment. I'm absolutely sure I've done worse than that multiple times in my relatively short lifetime. And by the will of God, I'm still alive. Example 11. Paul condones slavery in Ephesians 6:5 through 9, Colossians 3:22, all the way to 4:1, with 1 Timothy 6:1 and 2 saying, Let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. Those who have believing masters must not be respectful on the ground that they are brothers. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefited by their good services are believers and beloved. Example 12. Paul says women shouldn't lead service in 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15, and with 1 Corinthians 14:34 and 35, saying, The women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are subject themselves, just as the law also says. If they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church. Now, as a fellow Christian, if you are a fellow Christian, you might be wondering why I'm doing this, perhaps giving ammunition to those who try to attack the Bible, and you might be trying to excuse all of these examples and take them out of the category of immoral. Sorry for tricking anyone, but with guile, I just made my point. God never contradicted his own law, meaning he never commanded or acted anything against his morals, even though you feel like he broke your moral code. Which this point might come up. God is simply immoral and I'm moral. In other words, is it fair that God makes the rules he's going to follow anyways, that we are all expected to follow? And that's an exhaustive and maybe even an unnecessary argument that gets nowhere, because it comes down to if you believe in the possibility of a God. If you have that curiosity, then you'll eventually get your answers. If you have no desire or curiosity of a God, then nothing will turn you towards it. But the quick answer to why an all-powerful, all-knowing God would make the rules is, well, he's all-knowing and all-powerful, and you're not, and you really couldn't get close to his level of nuance. If we, as a collective mind, don't have the foresight of seeing what a political policy change would do in the near future, what makes you think that you can sit down and come up with a way of life specific enough that would work for all time, regardless of societal culture? Not to mention, as God, he's making an instruction manual for his creation, describing our deepest needs and functions and giving wise parameters for them. You, on the other hand, are inconsistent, ever-changing, emotionally and physically unhealthy, inconsiderate, ignorant of what's going on within you, and you want to decide what's good for all people and all time. You're on some teenage narcissism if you think so. Like Light Yagami from Death Note, if you get that reference. Another point to that, for God, it's not so much he makes the rules that he constrains himself to. He's simply acting consistently within himself, and his being is perfect. Therefore, to have the character of God is to be perfect, which goes into the deeper idea of being holy is not about what you don't do or do, but who you are in your identity, which, full circle, the idea of being holy or perfect is about being holy or perfect. Redundant, I know, but for some reason humans read be holy in 1 Peter 1:15 and 16, and for some reason they think act holy.